The Young and the Restless spoilers. Sharon had always believed she understood Noah better than anyone else. His rhythms, his emotional shifts, the way his eyes softened when he was hiding something, or sharpened when he was about to confess a truth he didn't want to admit. He was her son, her first deep connection to motherhood, her fragile line to innocence after a lifetime of trauma. But when he returned from Los Angeles and stepped back into their home, there was something wrong, something off, something that made both her and Nick exchange the same silent look at exactly the same moment. The look parents only share when instinct begins screaming before logic can form words. At first, it felt like paranoia, fear left over from Matt's pursuit, anxiety amplified by the knowledge that Los Angeles had changed all of them even after they ran. But then the unsettling details began to line up, small, almost imperceptible fractures in Noah's behavior that formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Nick noticed it first. Sharon felt it second, and by the time they voiced it out loud, the world they believed they still understood had already shifted into something far more sinister. Nick's suspicion struck like a hard truth. He didn't want to say but couldn't swallow anymore. This isn't Noah. The words hung between them like a foreign language that should never have been spoken, yet suddenly explained everything: the stiffness in Noah's posture, the strange unfamiliarity in his smile, the way he held his shoulders as if he were wearing someone else's body. The worst part was the realization that this wasn't just a change in personality, it wasn't trauma, it wasn't stress, it was identity. Sharon, already trembling from the ache of maternal dread, felt her breath collapse as she stared into the face she had loved for decades and saw nothing familiar behind the eyes. She had always believed a mother could recognize her child even in darkness. But what if someone had stolen that face entirely? What if the skin, the voice, the gestures were all a mask? The fear became unbearable when Sharon remembered all the strange coincidences surrounding Sienna and Matt in Los Angeles, the timing of Noah's disappearance, the silence between his messages, the way Sienna had acted, guilty, evasive, frightened, but not of Noah, rather frightened of being caught and now back in Genoa City. Everything aligned too neatly. Sienna, Matt, and the man wearing Noah's identity seemed to move with a synchronized precision, as if they were operating as a unit, a team, a carefully constructed triad engineered for one purpose: infiltration. This raised the most horrifying question of all. What if the recent accident, the very event that had supposedly pushed Noah back into their arms, had been staged? What if the crash that made everyone rush to Noah's side had not been an accident at all but a carefully orchestrated diversion created to lure the Newmans into dropping their guard? Sharon's mind spiraled with images of staged ambulances, falsified reports, the subtle coordination of three dangerous individuals who thrived on deception. Matt was capable of faking anything, Sienna was capable of lying about anything, and a man skilled enough to impersonate Noah physically through makeup, surgery, or manipulation was capable of stepping into their son's life without hesitation. When Sharon finally broke, it wasn't a collapse, it was a realization. Her tears were not from fear, but from recognition, because she knew deep down, with a mother's certainty, that the person standing in her living room breathing her son's air, speaking with her son's voice, was a stranger, a predator, a counterfeit designed to infiltrate her home. And when she looked at the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the exact replication of Noah's expressions, she realized the truth was even more horrifying. This wasn't merely an impersonation. This was a calculated mimicry crafted by someone who had studied Noah in a way only a stalker would, someone who had rehearsed his cadence, copied his habits, and replicated his mannerisms with chilling accuracy, which meant only one thing: Noah wasn't safe. Noah wasn't nearby. Noah wasn't in their home. Noah wasn't the one who walked through their door. Someone else was wearing his life. Nick reacted. Faster than Sharon, the moment the truth clicked, his body shifted into protective mode, rage, fear, and paternal instinct, merging into a single force. He replayed every interaction, every moment the imposter had spoken, realizing he had missed subtle cues: the handshake that felt slightly wrong, the hug that lacked warmth, the strange moment when Noah did not remember a detail from his own childhood. These red flags were not oversight. They were warnings. Nick's stomach turned cold as he connected the final dots. Noah must have been taken long before this imposter arrived. which meant Sienna and Matt and this mysterious false Noah were working together for a reason, not for money, not for revenge against the Newman Empire, but for something darker, personal, intimate, something rooted in Matt's obsession with control and Sienna's twisted loyalty. The possibility became unavoidable. Sienna and Matt had abducted the real Noah, and the imposter had been placed in front of Sharon and Nick as a decoy, a psychological weapon designed to confuse them, delay them, and dismantle their instinct to fight back until it was too late. The horrifying truth deepened when Sharon remembered the expression in the imposter's eyes, too calm, too observant, too calculating, not like a son returning home shaken by trauma, but like a spy analyzing a battlefield. The realization cracked her open. She had hugged a stranger. She had said Noah's name to someone who wasn't Noah. She had loved a mask. Now the only questions that mattered were the ones that left both of them trembling. Where is the real Noah? Why has he been taken? What do Matt and Sienna want with him, and who is the man wearing Noah's face? Because if Matt Clark was behind this, and if Sienna was part of it, then the imposter was not just a pawn. He was a weapon, and the Newmans had allowed him into their home. The night had the kind of heaviness that did not come from weather, but from dread, a suffocating stillness that settled over the Newman property like a warning. Sharon could not shake the uneasy feeling that had been clawing at her chest since the moment she realized there was something wrong with the man calling himself Noah. Every glance, every gesture, every faintly off rhythm in his behavior and echoed in her mind had only sharpened the edges of her fear when she heard voices drifting through the darkness that did not belong where they were. The tension inside her snapped into focus from the hallway, barely breathing. She and Nick recognized them instantly, the low, tense cadence of Noah's voice and the thinner, frayed notes of Sienna's. They shouldn't have been there, speaking in secret, huddled in a corner of the house that was meant to be still. The words themselves were indistinct, but the tone carried the sharpness of conspiracy. Something in Nick's eyes changed, a flash of grim certainty as he motioned Sharon back into the shadows, both of them slipping silently along the wall until the two figures came into sharp view at the far end of the corridor, dimly lit by the weak glow of a side lamp. Sharon's heart pounded in a dissonant rhythm as she watched Noah and Sienna lean close, their bodies angled toward each other like accomplices rather than lovers. Their whispering, quick, anxious, rehearsed. There was no comfort in their proximity, only calculation. Sharon could not make out specific phrases, only fragments, mentions of timing, of keeping them calm. Of one more night. It was enough. It was more than enough. The realization cut through her like ice. They were not grieving. They were not recovering. They were coordinating. Nick's patience shattered in the space of a breath. The time for doubt, for analysis, for waiting on security reports and quiet observation was over. Fury ignited in him like gasoline thrown onto an open flame. All the nights of pretending, all the forced conversations with a stranger wearing his son's face, all the helplessness of watching Sharon question her own instincts crashed together in a single, merciless decision. Without warning, he lunged from the shadows, his footsteps pounding through the hall like judgment. Sharon followed, not because she had a plan, but because there was no longer any reality in which she could stand still and do nothing. Sienna's eyes widened first, her entire body stiffening as she realized they were being watched. Noah turned just a fraction too late. Nick was already on him, his hands slamming into the imposter's shoulders with a force driven by weeks of anger and years of paternal fear. The man stumbled back, hitting the wall, his expression contorted between shock and the first flicker of fight. But this time, Nick did not stop at questions. He did not start with demands. His hands went straight for the face he had been trying so desperately to accept as his son's. The moment Nick's fingers closed around the imposter's jaw, Sharon saw the terror flash through the stranger's eyes, not the fear of a son being grabbed by his father, but the fear of a man whose disguise was about to be violently torn away. Nick dragged him forward, his grip moving up along the cheek, his thumb catching on something that should not have been there, a telltale edge, a slight GF where there should have been only skin. Nick's stomach twisted with disgust and vindication as his fingers dug in and found purchase on a seam, a subtle ridge of artificial flesh that no real human face would ever possess. With a savage yank driven by every sleepless night he pulled, The sound was nearly unbearable, a wet, sickening peal as the carefully crafted silicone mask resisted for a split second before yielding. Sharon watched in horror as the skin distorted, stretched and then tore away, coming loose in Nick's fist with a weight that felt obscene beneath it, glistening under the dim light. A second, face emerged raw, sweaty, alive and utterly wrong. The transformation was grotesque, more monstrous because it revealed not a monster, but an ordinary stranger whose very ordinariness made his violation more chilling. For a heartbeat, time froze. The stripped face blinked at them, wide-eyed, panting, his cheeks now mottled with red where the adhesive had tugged at real flesh. Gone were Noah's familiar lines, his boyish bone structure, his soft eyes. In their place stood a man with harder features, narrower eyes, a jaw sharpened by malice and desperation. Sharon's knees nearly buckled as she stared at him, her mind desperately trying to reconcile the image of her son with the thing that had been layered over this stranger's bone and blood. She gasped a sound somewhere between a sob and a broken exhale, realizing in that horrifying instant that every embrace, every word of reassurance she had forced herself to accept from Noah had been stolen by this man. She had been mothering a mask. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over as the guilt hit her, irrational but suffocating. She had not recognized her own child's absence. She had let a predator stand where her son should have stood. The stranger reacted on instinct, twisting his body, trying to break free from Nick's brutal grip. For a second, he surged forward, his elbow slamming into Nick's chest as he tried to push off the wall and bolt past them, the primal urge to escape taking over now that his guise was gone. But Nick was faster, fueled by something beyond physical strength. He grabbed a fistful of the man's shirt, yanked him back with such force that the imposter's spine collided with the plaster, again, jarring his head and knocking the breath out of him. The man swung a fist blindly, but Nick caught it, slammed it down and drove his own fist straight into the exposed, unmasked face. The impact cracked through the hallway like a gunshot. Bone met bone, flesh split and a ribbon of blood burst from the imposter's nose. Nick did not pause to watch it drip. Another punch followed, this one even more brutal. The sound dull and heavy as it crushed into already damaged tissue. The man's head snapped sideways, smearing blood against the wall. His eyes rolling with a dizzy blend of rage and terror. Sharon flinched, but she did not intervene. She had never condoned violence. Had always believed in restraint and structure and the illusion of control. But tonight, there was nothing abstract about what had been done to them. This man had inhabited her son. He had stolen footholds in their trust. Every hit Nick landed felt in some dark, painful way, like the only language the imposter understood. Sienna, caught between shock and survival, instinct, tried to flee, but Sharon moved with a clarity she did not know she still possessed, with the kind of strength born from desperation. She grabbed Sienna's arm, nails digging in, dragging her back before she could vanish into the nearest doorway or stairwell. Sienna struggled. Her voice reduced to panicked breaths, her body twisting as she tried to break free, but Sharon held on with a grip so tight it surprised them both. Years of grief, loss and regret had left Sharon feeling fragile in many moments, but now every fracture hardened into something unyielding. She forced Sienna against the opposite wall, pinning her there. Her eyes wild, her chest heaving was no longer hypothetical or subtle. It glowed on her face as fear-shame, the frantic calculation of someone realizing that the script she had rehearsed no longer mattered. She was caught. The mask was gone. The lie had collapsed in the center of the hallway. The imposter's struggle began to falter as Nick's punches continued to crash down, each one punctuated by the months of fear he had been forced to swallow. It was no longer about extracting information. It was about reclaiming something stolen. Nick's fists moved with a grim, controlled fury, landing directly onto the man's nose, cheek, jaw, the exposed face now swollen and reddened beneath the smear of drying adhesive residue where the silicone skin had once clung. The imposter's resistance weakened, arms, heavy, knees bending under the relentless assault. He sputtered, coughed, spat blood onto the floor, but still tried to twist away his instincts, refusing to surrender even as his body began to give out. Nick grabbed him by the collar, dragged him downward and shoved him onto his knees with a savage shove. The man sank, his movements, sluggish, shoulders heaving as he struggled for air, Sharon, still pinning Sienna in place, watched with hollow horror and hardening resolve. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a bad choice, a lapse in judgment or a miscommunication. This was evil. This was engineered. She could see it now in the way Sienna's eyes darted not to Nick, not to Sharon, but to the crumpled, unmasked man on the floor, as if searching for invisible instructions. Their entire scheme had relied on illusion. Now that the illusion was gone, they had nothing left but fear. Sharon seized on that Sienna and the impostor were no longer guests, acquaintances, or even adversaries. They were suspects, they were kidnappers. They were the reason she did not know where her real son was or what condition he might be in. The thought slammed into her with such force she almost doubled over while she stood here holding Sienna against a wall while Nick pummeled the stranger who had worn her son's face. Noah could be somewhere alone. Hurt, terrified, wondering if his family even knew he was missing. The grief turned quickly to rage. It burned through her shock, through the helplessness that had threatened to paralyze her earlier. She leaned closer to Sienna, her hands gripping tighter, her voice low but trembling with a fury that made Sienna's eyes fill with tears. Sharon did not need to scream to be terrifying. The quiet, controlled intensity of a mother pushed beyond her limits was far more frightening than any shouted threat. Nick, breathing hard now, finally paused just long enough for clarity to push through the red haze in his mind. He stared down at the stranger, chest heaving, fists still clenched and slick with another man's blood. The mask, the grotesque, lifeless husk of Noah's stolen face lay crumpled on the floor a short distance away. Its false features twisted and empty. Nick's gaze flicked from it back to the broken face kneeling before him. The contrast was nauseating. He couldn't decide which image angered him more, the synthetic lie, or the living coward who had worn it. His muscles ached with the desire to keep hitting to make the man feel even a fraction of what he had inflicted, but time was no longer on their side. Every second they spent venting their fury was another second Noah remained missing. That realization slammed into Nick with the same impact as one of his own punches. They needed answers. They needed them now. Sienna, cornered and shaking, began to understand that the game was no longer about maintaining the fiction. It was about survival. She had underestimated the Newmans, underestimated Sharon's intuition, underestimated Nick's capacity for brutality when it came to protecting his family. And in the shadows behind all of her choices, there was Matt who had convinced her that this plan could work, that they could gaslight an entire family, manipulate their grief, use a manufactured Noah as bait, while the real one remained hidden. Matt, who always seemed 3 steps ahead and yet now was nowhere to be seen, leaving her to absorb the fallout. A bitter flicker of resentment bloomed in her chest. Matt had promised control, but this was chaos. This was pain. This was blood smeared across the walls of a house. She had never truly been welcome in the imposter's next attempt to move was met with Nick's hand fisting in his hair, yanking his head up, forcing him to meet Nick's blazing eyes. Nick's voice, when he spoke, was hoarse, raw, barely containing the violence thrumming beneath each word. Sharon's grip on Sienna tightened in tandem, the two parents forming a human vice around the pair that had dared to play God with their son's existence. The air in the hallway grew thick with the sound of labored breathing, muffled sobs, distant footsteps of security guards now rushing toward the commotion, but arriving too late to prevent the core truth from exploding into the open. The lie was over. The mask was off, the roles were reversed. The predators were on the floor. What remained stark and undeniable was the central horror that would now drive every choice Nick and Sharon made. Noah was not here. Noah had been missing right under their noses while a stranger pretended to be him inside their home. Sienna knew where Noah was, or at the very least knew who did. The man on his knees might know more, and somewhere out there in the darkness beyond their property line, Matt Clark would be waiting, confident in the structure of his schemes, perhaps even entertained at the idea that the Newmans had finally uncovered the first layer of his deception, but he had underestimated something crucial. The moment a parent discovers someone has stolen their child, the rules of the game cease to matter. There is no restraint, there is no patience. There is only the relentless, unshakable determination to get that child back, No matter who has to be broken along the way in that dimly lit hallway with a bloody mask on the floor and two conspirators pinned and battered, the true war began.